Welcome to another episode of a Triple Helix instructional video building a West Coast drivetrain. And in this episode, episode 12, we will be assembling the gearbox. And the skills we'll be learning in this episode are essentially how to take all the little bits and pieces and put them together to get a gearbox. So let's get started.
Let's build a gearbox. So we cut the two gearbox plates in the laser in a previous meeting. So you notice they're different. One of them is, we're going to call it the motor plate, and the other one we're going to call the inner plate. The inner plate goes on the inside of the drivetrain. The motor plate mounts right up against the inside of the drive rail. So the very first thing we can do is attach our three motors to the motor plate. You grab it, and we're going to put a motor into the motor hole. Any one of them. 1, 2, 3.
Does it matter which way the wire faces?
It does. Let's hold off on that decision too. Okay, now flip it over so we can see it. We're going to take this other plate. This is again the inner plate, and kind of compare it. And when we put it over, you notice that there's a large hole and a small hole. At this point, we're ready to attach one of the two screws, and that's going to match up with the big hole. So we're going to attach just the screw. You notice the motor gets attached by two screws. We're going to attach just the screw that corresponds with the big hole. So we're going to do this one. Does that one there? We'll do this one that corresponds with that. This one that corresponds with that. And the screws that we're going to use for that are these weird-looking things. So go ahead and by hand just thread one of those screws into the hole. And then we'll repeat that. We don't even need to tighten anything yet. So now we know which screw to put in here because it corresponds with this big hole. You notice that the flange is on the opposite side that we can't see, and here this other plate, the flanges are going to be on top. So the flanges are on opposite sides of the gearbox. So now before we do this last motor, let's flip it over and think about what we've done here. Whenever we attach these three motors, there's two choices about which way to orient them. And on this side, the motor is symmetric all the way around, so it doesn't matter. But when we look at the other side, we have these wires coming off, and they only come off on one side. So we have to make another choice about which direction these motors come off. So now is when you should cut to a clip of the gearboxes on our other robots where we chose to make all the wires come off on the outside of the circle here. So why don't we set them up so that the wires are all on the outside, which means flipping this one around. Okay, this one with the wire going towards the outside.
And those funky fasteners that you're using, what are those?
Okay, they're actually an assembly of two different things. The inside part, actually let's take one apart. The inside is a set screw that's been threaded into a female threaded hex standoff. The standoff I think is like 3/8 of an inch long. It's a 1032 screw. The set screw is maybe like 3/4 of an inch long. And the really neat part about it, the expensive part, is that the set screw's been drilled down the center. So it's called a vented set screw. You can actually push air through it if you want to. Each one of these is actually two parts.
And those have been pre-made up?
Yep. And there's been a little bit of Loctite applied. Oops, can you do that? A little bit of Loctite applied in the threads in those parts. And it just sat overnight. I think the next step, why don't we install our center 72 tooth gear that goes between all these motors and have it run on this shaft. That'll be the next part. So we could install a snap ring on that shaft, put it through this bearing, put the gear on it. Okay. So this is going to go in from the bottom. So can you put that in from the other side? These are Thunderhex shafts going through Thunderhex bearings. I think what we actually have to do is slide it up, and then put the shaft into the hex board. We'll walk that guy up and then spin that guy into place. Good. So if we do this, how are we going to get the? Yeah, we can still reach in there and do that. Why don't you go ahead and put this this next 48 tooth gear on here, and then another snap ring, and that'll lock together the entire cluster shaft. This backwards though? Yeah, it's backwards. The flanges of these bearings go on the outside, and then a gear, and then a snap ring. Sweet. Before we get to these spacers, we're going to install the other 3 fasteners that attach our motors. And those are these ones. They're socket head cap screws, and they're pretty long. I think they're like 1.25 inches long or something. And we also have to fish this spacer in between these 2 plates when we install that. So you have to reach in with your fingers, or maybe with needle nose pliers, and get that to line up with these 3 holes that are left. And then we'll put that long screw through and tighten them up. And these screws are special too. They've also been drilled through. You can see they've got a hole running through the entire length of them. That makes them super special and very expensive. It's not super difficult, but it takes a little bit of a reach. Alright, so now we have a sandwich of these 2 plastic plates. We have our motors are now attached with 2 fasteners on each motor. And those later, when we tighten them, the motor will be clamped down to the motor plate very tightly. First through this fastener directly to the motor plate, and then the second one through this long fastener, which is clamping using that plastic spacer on the inside. Now we need to hold these plates apart at the right distance apart, and to do that we have these other spacers that we made in a previous session. These go in. Maybe Nia can do this part. These slip in on the 2 sides here, and we're going to use another set of fasteners to clamp them down on all these 6 holes. These 2 and these 2, and then we'll do something else with these other holes up here. So the direction matters, because this one we're going to put a 1/4 inch hole through, and then the other one we're going to put a 1032 hole through. So can you try to press that in? We might have to. So the plates warp a little bit, just kind of they have a natural shape. And while you're doing that, I'm going to just loosely thread on this nylock lock nut onto the back, just so it doesn't all fall apart. All right, and then just loosely put this nut on the opposite side down here. Cool, halfway done. Do the same thing with this bar. Okay, good. These screws clamp together the tops, this top end of the gearbox up here through these holes. So what you got to do is put the spacer in here, and don't drop it, and get it lined up with this hole, and then put the screw through the same way, and then thread the nut on the back. All right, what's the next step of putting our gearbox together? So I think the next step is we'll tighten all the structural fasteners here, and then we'll do the motors. And I think that'll bring this gearbox into a little bit better alignment before we tighten the motors up. Tighten them up until it just starts to feel stiff. I don't want you to crush it, because you are very strong kids, and you absolutely have the power to crush this gearbox, this plastic gearbox. So now you guys can tighten up the motors. The motors, remember, they're attached by 2 screws each. One of them is exposed out here. You can do that with this Allen wrench. And the other one, we're actually going to reach down with a socket and tighten up the hex standoff that's down inside there. And these holes have been sized appropriately that we can put our socket down in there and tighten them up. And again, it doesn't need to be super tight, just kind of a little tight. So if we're assembling this for the final time, we might use Loctite on the ends of the screws that are attaching the motors, because those go into blind holes and we don't have a way to keep them tight. So we talked a lot about the vented screws that are all over the place in this gearbox, and there's a purpose for them. And the purpose is to let us squirt air into these motors. The motors otherwise are sealed, and the only way that they cool down is by radiation and conduction away from this case. But the hot parts of the motor are inside the case, and they really have no connection. They have very limited connection between the hot parts and the case. So if you're able to blow air into the motor, you have a chance of directly cooling down the parts that are hot. And so far we've just been experimenting with that concept. But our friends at 1610 actually did this during the season. They had the same style, gearbox. It was this design, and they ran air from the exhausts of their pneumatic manifold, and every time a cylinder moved, the other side of the cylinder would exhaust. The low pressure side would exhaust, and that air got squirted into the gearbox and helped cool down the motors. We don't really have any data about how effective that was, but it's a really interesting concept and something that we're still including in this design because we think it's probably a good idea that we're going to do some more experiments on and learn about. So here's the Allen wrench. Go ahead and install these 3 pneumatic fittings into the faces of these 3 standoffs. Yep. And you're much stronger than the part, so I want you to stop when it just starts to feel tight.
Yep. Is this one of these?
Yep. These, I believe, they may be brass, or they're either brass or stainless. And if they're brass, then they're super fragile. And they seal with an O-ring that's on that face that you're screwing into. That O-ring actually seals against the face of the standoff. So when you're installing them, you can actually feel it start to contact, and it feels sort of rubbery, and you can feel the O-ring start to squish. Cool. These things accept 5/32 diameter tubing, and we have some of that. And when they're pushed to connect fittings, just like the 1/4-inch ones that teams normally use. So the next step is to install our output shaft. So this is our output shaft. It goes through this bearing, and you notice we've left off this bearing here, and we'll talk about that in a second. So let's start by installing a snap ring in this snap ring groove on that shaft. All right, that gets installed into this bearing from this side, but before that we got to put this 64 tooth gear on that shaft. So go ahead and put that on. So who knows our total gear reduction in this gearbox? Everybody know? So we have a 12 tooth pinion on each of our 3 sims, and that engages with a 72 tooth gear that we can see inside. That's on the same shaft. It's called the cluster shaft with this 48 tooth gear, and that's driving this 64 tooth gear. So all together, if you multiply those two ratios, you'll get the total reduction of our gearbox. Now our gearbox is pretty functionally complete. We've got motors, we've got a structure, we even have an output shaft, but we need another feature, which is going to go right here. It's a bearing that's going to be used for a bunch of purposes. One purpose is to carry the loads on the output shaft, but another is also to align this gearbox with the frame rail. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to have this bearing, which is it's a radial thunder hex bearing. We're going to take it and we're going to slip it over this output shaft. We're going to use spacers to put it into this hole, into this bearing bore, so that half of it still sticks out. I think we're going to put 5/8 of spacer on this shaft inside the gearbox, and then put our output bearing on. All right. These are
Which one goes in first?
either one, doesn't matter.
Alright.
All we're doing is we're just adding up to half an inch or 5/8 of an inch. So the first one was an eighth, the second one was a half, and now we got a bearing. And then we'll turn it so we can look at the cross section, and we'll see that we have half of the width of the bearing sticking out from this inside surface of the motor plate of the gearbox. And we said at the beginning, the motor plate is the one that butts right up against the inside of the drive rail. So now it's time to do that. Actually install the gearbox onto the drive rail.